Welcome to the Department of Natural Resources Fisheries Division Dive Team. Scuba systems as we know it were developed in 1942 by none other than Jacques Cousteau. This type of diving is referred to as scuba, or self-contained underwater breathing apparatus, and allows for free diving without being tethered. And although there have been remarkable advancements in underwater cameras and underwater remotely operated vehicles, ROVs, at times being down on the actual substrate or sampling the aquatic life must be in person. Although the DNR Fisheries Division has been involved in occasional diving events, it wasn't until 2009 that an official policy was adopted. The Fisheries Division dive policy was developed to conduct diving operations in the Great Lakes and inland waters for scientific purposes, with the objective of conducting research studies, assessments, and surveys to provide information, decision support, and advice to make science-based management decisions. It should be noted all Fisheries Division divers have positions within fisheries, such as biologists and technicians, and volunteer to participate on the dive team. One long-term study that the dive team has been involved with is evaluating spawning success of native fish species on shallow reefs. These reefs can vary in depth from 3 feet to 30 feet. How we can determine levels of spawning success is through egg deposition. That is where we quantify how many eggs are laid over the substrate. This is done one of two ways, either by burying egg nets, which are a bag-like gear, or a funnel, which is also buried and then pumped from the surface. Both techniques require divers to bury them in the rocky habitat where species like lake trout, whitefish, and herring prefer to spawn. While getting counts on eggs can be an important indicator of species population trends, divers are also able to determine estimates of egg loss from physical forces such as wave energy and egg predators like the exotic round goby or rusty crayfish. This is done by stocking live eggs of another trout species, such as rainbow trout, and mixing them with beads that are of similar size and density. If the eggs are gone but the beads remain, they were consumed by egg predators. But if both eggs and bead numbers are low, they were impacted by physical forces. Another interesting project taken on by the dive team was Predator Suppression. A seismic gun, which is triggered from above, sends a strong shock wave through the water and is currently being used on the Illinois River to deter Asian carp from entering Lake Michigan. Our intent was to damage or deter the exotic egg predators like the round goby and rusty crayfish from using the reef habitat just prior to spawning. Although we did see some results on the native rock bass, we did not succeed in killing round gobies. It was effective at damaging their otoliths, however it is unclear if that would have a long-term effect. Also, it was obvious the rusty crayfish did not like the shockwave. Unfortunately, it did not have any lethal effects. It was, however, successful at destroying a GoPro. Through our past spawning reef observation, we noticed the large negative impacts that rusty crayfish have had on eggs of native fish species. And through a mark and recapture study, we've been able to determine there was a large migration of rusty crayfish up on native spawning reefs during fall spawning. Many of these crayfish then remain on the reef and feed on the eggs they can access throughout the winter. This leads us to a study where we attempt to remove as many exotic crayfish as possible on the reef and slow the migration from outside using benthic barrier nets. These barriers are a series of vinyl obstacles that crayfish can't easily pass. Preliminary results are encouraging, but the project has been very labor intense. In recent years, the dive team has been involved with a large comprehensive project looking at the cause of the upswing in botulism cases in migrating birds. This has been impacted the strongest in the Sleeping Bear Dunes area, and the cause has been linked to algal growth, quagga mussels, and round goby life cycles. Our dive team has joined the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee in determining what would happen if algal growth and the mussels are removed. Preliminary results show once the substrate was scraped clean by divers, both mussels and algal growth slowed, lowering the risk of botulism outbreaks. Now, larger treatment areas are being considered. We in Fisheries Division know that the success of a fish species doesn't revolve around its life cycle, but rather the life cycle of all creatures in that ecosystem. Fisheries personnel have teamed up with mussel experts from Central Michigan University to assist in identifying mussels from rivers in Michigan. Like fish species, mussels can be a good indicator of water quality. Many mussels are very susceptible to pollution, just like many can handle high tolerances. Biologists can use these mussel surveys as an indicator of river health, just like the most recent surveys on the Kalamazoo and Detroit rivers. Also, one bonus is we got to observe other agencies' diving operation and their setup. At times, the dive team can travel to amazing places to accomplish the goals at hand. One project was to join Fisheries Division staff from Northern Lake Huron Management Unit and Fish Production to retrofit a turbine into a net pen at the Sue Edison Power Plant, located at the Lake Superior State University Aquatic Lab. This area had been used in the past to imprint salmon before being released, but hadn't been used in some time and came into disrepair. Divers patched up holes that had been worn through the building's concrete structure and replaced the rails used to hold the retaining net in place. Shortly after the repairs, Atlantic salmon from the Platte River State Fish Hatchery were stocked into the net pen and continued their rearing before being later released into the St. Mary's River. Through the years, it has become apparent to fisheries managers that the best way to manage a fish isn't just by looking at the biology of that species, but including its whole ecosystem. This has led to the addition of good quality habitat. Throughout the Great Lakes, fisheries personnel have created reefs to assist fish with cover, a place to look for food, and spawning habitat. The target species that benefit are lake sturgeon, lake trout, lake whitefish, cisco, smallmouth bass, and walleye, and the positive effects are almost seen immediately. The dive team has helped with the pre-construction phase, which includes documenting past fish data, best location for new construction, and materials to be used. Then divers assist in the implementation phase, verifying things go as planned, like reef location and reef height. The final and most exciting part is the post-construction phase, documenting the positive effects these reefs had on the fish community. Recent reef projects were constructed in Lake Michigan's Grand Traverse Bay and Saginaw Bay in Lake Huron. Some new reef designs call for setups to monitor what is occurring deep under the reef. That has been nearly impossible to document in the past, but by placing gabion baskets deep within the reef, scientists can now explain the ecosystem details top to bottom. One thing to quickly note, to have such a productive dive team, it requires divers to be well trained. This is taken very serious, and all divers spend time training every year. Most division divers have earned advanced diving certifications. Working on the Great Lakes can be nasty at times, but we typically avoid diving in rough weather due to safety risks to divers and boat crew. At times, weather events blow in and we need to abort diving missions. Another risk to diving is low visibility. Soft, silty bottoms are common in lakes and streams, but when stirred up, divers can lose their dive partners. In this type of habitat, the goal would be to avoid stirring up the bottom or using a tether. This is a connecting rope or strap that allows divers to stay together. Then there's the risk of cold and hypothermia. This is the number one risk to dive team members as we study fish species like lake trout, lake whitefish, and cisco that spawn in late fall, early winter. Divers take huge steps to stay warm, relatively speaking, of course. Precautions include using dry suits, hand and toe warmers to get that extra 5 minutes in the water, and then retreating to a cooler of hot water. Even with all these steps, divers need to avoid the elements when possible and reduce the number of diving missions before the gear and divers freeze up. And then there's the diver observations. This is watching the ecosystem from their level. It's here we witness behaviors that trigger researchers to come up with new, innovative ways to manage, creating new techniques to assess populations or thoughts on how to reduce impacts of exotic species. Maybe figuring out bottlenecks, like studying what happened to the young lake trout fry in their natural habitat. Here, divers observe the effects of venting yellow perch that have been retrieved from deep water. This is a common practice used in the ocean that allows fish to return to the bottom while avoiding predators like other fish or birds. Then there's the occasional observations of coming across swarms of mysids or watching how alewives feed without being eaten. As the number one prey item of our salmon, learning their behaviors is essential. While underwater, divers often get the view that looks like an aquarium or ocean reef. We're witnessing the interaction with sport fish like walleye or smallmouth bass, testing their aggressiveness with the exotic crayfish as prey. And finally, the divers get the satisfaction of witnessing fish species like lake trout swimming in and utilizing the habitat that was developed for their success.